Hello and welcome back to Bookish and welcome back to part 4 of Faulkner in August. This will be my last Faulkner in August video in which we talk about the last section. The last section of The Sound of the Fury is oftentimes, and in our Voxer conversations, the group doing these videos is referred to it as Dilsey's section. And that's because primarily the story is told from Dilsey's point of view. But I will point out this is also kind of like Jason Part 2 section, because there is a significant and important part of this in which we see Jason's action. This is the only section of the novel that is not told first person from the point of view of one of the characters. If you've been reading along, you know that the first 3 sections of The Sound of the Fury are told by Caddy Compson's brothers. Her brother Benji, who is mentally impaired, her brother Quentin, who commits suicide, and her brother Jason, who is, well, let's just say, angry. Pretty much all the time, angry and resentful. And this last section pretty much follows the adventures of Jason and Dilsey in 2 separate things they do on Easter Sunday in 1928. That is the day on which this takes place, and that day of Easter is significant. The day in which Christians celebrate Jesus rising from the grave and ascending into heaven. There is significance to that, I believe, in this section as well. So one of the things I think that comes up after, kind of putting yourself through the work of reading the first 3 sections and getting to section 4, I think a lot of people find this section to be somewhat disappointing. I find it that way myself, that I want more answers. I wanted to have it explained to me. I want to know what Faulkner was up to, because the truth of the matter is, with The Sound of the Fury, I think there are 2 really different ways you can look at what happens here. Either this is just the story of a family tragedy, the descent of the Compson family, that family kind of slowly falling apart, and the impact that has on its members, and the impact that has on the African Americans who work for them. That's one way of viewing the story, and you can also view the story as an allegory, perhaps, for the decline of the South in the years after the Civil War. A couple of important things to keep in mind here. We're talking about Dilsey, who I believe is in her 50s or 60s, somewhere around that. We are talking about all of these characters living the time period after the Civil War, and the South that's changing is really the Jim Crow South, and that's the South that Faulkner is describing. So I think either way you want to read it, the story works. I don't think you have to go to all the great allegorical extents that I'm going to go to here to try to draw a deeper meaning. I think as a family tragedy that plays itself out, and as a story about the decline of a family in the American South during the Jim Crow era, I think it works that way too. I do also think there are probably deeper ideas here that are at work. So the first thing that I'll point out, and I'm just going to steal Alan's thunder, sorry Alan. Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, his videos are in my Faulkner in August 2020 playlist. He will point out that oftentimes Faulkner likes to end a story where he begins. This kind of closed loop story is something Faulkner does. That's true in Light in August, and it's true here. The story begins with Benji watching golfers and essentially mourning for his sister Caddy's absence, and it ends there. In the exact same place with the exact same action. And I think this in some ways suggests that Faulkner believes that his characters are caught in this kind of closed system, this repeating series of mistakes with, maybe increasing damage or increasing casualties that come out of that, but caught in this kind of this trap of repeating the same things over and over again. I think you can take that and apply that to this section here as well. But this is not a section without hope. This is not a section in which Faulkner is saying everybody's caught in this loop. And most specifically, this then gets back to the story being set on Easter Sunday. Easter is a day of hope. It's a day of renewal. It's a day of redemption. It's a day of resurrection. It's a day of, escaping from death. It is a celebration of all those things, It is a day in which people escape from, have an opportunity to escape from sin and evil that's overtaking their lives and the lives of mankind. And I don't think it's an accident that Faulkner has Miss Quentin, Caddy Compson's daughter, escape from the Compson family home on this day. I think that that is intentional. There are two main things that happen in this section. One involving Jason, one involving Dilsey. So the first one involves Jason and Miss Quentin. Again, that's Caddy Compson's daughter. Jason more or less wakes up to find, to realize that Miss Quentin, his niece, has broken into his room and stolen $3,000 that he had hidden in his closet, and she's run off with the guy from the show, which Jason was trying to catch her with in his section. Jason heads out after her. He's going to go catch her, and he's going to, bring her back, I guess. And he's going to show this guy in the red tie, this show guy, and teach him a lesson. He is plagued by headaches. He's plagued by self-doubt. Eventually, he gets himself to the town where the show is traveled to the next day. He goes on to one of the railroad cars that the show travels by. He has a confrontation with the showman, and the guy from the show, despite being old and looking frail, essentially beats the crap out of Jason. And Jason falls down and hits his head, and he has to be rescued by another guy from the show, who essentially tells him that he should just go on and not worry about Miss Quentin and this other man, that if he came back, this other guy from the show would kill him. And that's what Jason does. He is in no state after this confrontation to drive, so he pays an African-American man to drive him back home, and that African-American man essentially extorts money from him and charges more than probably the trip should have been worth. This section is significant to me. This story about what happened with Jason is significant to me because it puts Jason back in that list, back on that path that the Compsons take of men in the family trying to uphold the family honor, trying to control the women in their families, and failing. And in so doing, those failures signify the failure of the family. So a long time ago I made a video about the importance of social class in the South and William Faulkner. Let me just really quickly run back through that. In Southern society, before, during, after the Civil War, really up until the greater success of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 70s, Southern society is divided into essentially four sections, four unequal sections. At the top was the aristocracy. These are people who owned land. These are people who had servants. These are people who before the Civil War would have owned slaves. These are the Compsons. They are Southern aristocracy. Beneath them are business owners and yeoman farmers who own their own land. Both these social classes are white people, and both were worthy of respect. Beneath them were white people who were just considered to be trash. Sometimes in the Southern vernacular, they're referred to as poor white trash. And at the bottom levels of society, we had in Southern society at the time were African Americans. And if you think about what happens in the novel, what we see is the decline of the family from that status of being the aristocracy to essentially being one of its members being beaten up by a member of the poor white trash level of society. That guy from the show is certainly somebody Jason feels is beneath him. He feels like all those people are beneath him, and yet that guy beats him up. This is something then that never would have happened in the Old South, but we see happening in the South of the 1920s. Jason then being exploited, and because he has a headache and he can't drive, being exploited by an African-American man, again, shows how far in Southern society, is the way it was structured at the time, the Compsons have fallen, and I think it's meant to be symbolic of that. Near the end of the section, Luster, who is Dilsey's grandson, is driving Benji out to the graveyard. TP was supposed to come, but he didn't show up on time, so Luster takes Benji and he puts him in the wagon. He's going to drive him through town out to the graveyard, and Luster decides to go around a different way, and when he gets around there's Jason, who essentially comes out of the car and beats Luster up. This is Jason asserting his privilege as a white man to beat up an African-American man and trying to hold on to some level of separation for his family. And I think that it's symbolic that whole scene is symbolic of the final decline of the Compson family. Now, on a greater level, if you want to take that allegorical and apply it to white Southern society, maybe what Faulkner is showing is the decline of white Southern society to an increasingly violent, dissipated, weak group of people who can only assert any kind of control or dominance or assert themselves by carrying on acts of physical violence against African Americans. I think that is possibly true as well. And then we get to this section, and alongside of that is the section about Dilsey and her daughter Franny, and they're going to take Benji and their family to church. These are the African American servants who work for the Compsons and on the Compson place. And as they approach the church, Faulkner describes the church as being almost two-dimensional, as looking shabby, as not being very, looking like it was necessarily real or very inviting. And I think this is an important description he makes here, because I think what Faulkner is saying is he is describing this African American church with the eye of a white man, which Faulkner certainly was. And I think this section is important also because we are not in Dilsey's head. Faulkner does not presume to be able to get inside Dilsey's head and to know what she's thinking necessarily. We interpret what she's thinking by her actions. And I think that's significant. So what happens in church? It's Easter Sunday. This church congregation has invited a preacher, a guest preacher, to come in. I think he's coming from St. Louis. He is completely unremarkable physically when he gets there, and the whole congregation seems to be really disappointed. And he begins his sermon by speaking like a white man. Literally, his voice is the voice of a white man, and essentially the entire congregation is kind of almost lulled to sleep, lulled into a trance by this African American man speaking like a white man. By the way, Faulkner's description of the African American preacher here is incredibly uncomfortably racist, because he describes him as looking like a monkey. I'm not exactly sure what Faulkner was up to here. Is Faulkner trying to make a point? Is he trying to, or is it just some level of racism left in Faulkner? But Faulkner then has the preacher at some point come to a pause, and then he begins to preach and to talk in the vernacular of the African Americans, at least the vernacular that Faulkner gives the African Americans in the novel. And he preaches about redemption and the blood of the Lamb and saving Jesus and Jesus offering redemption to everybody. And this is incredibly moving. We see the call and response aspect of African American church in the South taking place. And Dilsey is incredibly moved. Benji, who is sitting there next to her, is transfixed. He is still and quiet, and Dilsey is crying because it was that powerful. And so this kind of switch of voice of the preacher at church, I think, is significant. I'm not saying I understand its significance, but if I were going to hazard a guess, I would guess that it is in some way Faulkner suggesting that African Americans, by essentially following the message of the white church or of white society in an attempt to imitate it, are never going to be fully happy, and that they'll be brought down along with it. And then in the end, when he's preaching like an African American, it's moving, and it kind of wakes them up, and it wakes Dilsey up. And Dilsey says something really important here, which is probably the most important quote, I think, in this section. So Dilsey and Franny and Benji and the others are walking home, and Dilsey's crying, and Franny tells her to stop, and Dilsey says, "I've seed to first and to last," Dilsey said. "Never you mind me." "First and last what?" Franny says. "Never you mind," Dilsey said. "I seed the beginning, and now I sees the ending." So in some ways I think that is representative of Dilsey being aware of both the changes that take place in Southern society as a whole, the beginning, and now she's seeing the ending, and the beginning and the ending of the Compson family saga with their kids, that she's been with them and she's seen them begin and she's seen them at the ending, and she sees hope perhaps for at least her and her family. Notice, by the way, when you read this section and go back and think about all the things that Dilsey and Roscom and other African American characters have said, and how they are constantly saying they may be black, but at least they're not the Compsons, and how here at the end Dilsey essentially accuses Luster of acting like the Compsons and telling him not to, because that way leads to destruction. So this almost sounds like that Faulkner is making an appeal for, complete African American emancipation from white society and a full go at equal rights, but he really isn't. Because Dilsey is the person here who we admire, and she's the one that we focus on. And she basically just tells her kids not to follow the lead of white people, but she's also not telling them to challenge their authority. That way may lead to bad things as well. And notice that Dilsey continues to work and continues to plan to work for the Compson family. This, I think, is part of Faulkner's own ideas about race, that change had to take place, that white Southerners, by refusing to change, were creating perhaps their own destruction, but that African Americans had to essentially bide their time, which is what Dilsey has done and what she appears to be encouraging her family members to do. So, to me, there are two big thematic things that this section kind of ties up about the Sound and the Fury. And those two things are impotence and freedom. So impotence is what all the Compson men have in common. They are all impotent in some way. Mr. Compson's drinking probably makes him actually physically impotent. His inability to control his wife in some ways is a sign of his impotence. I don't know exactly what happened to him or his wife. My theory I proposed last time about an incestuous relationship between Mrs. Compson and her brother Maury, breaking that family and breaking Mr. Compson, but something has driven him to this point where he's impotent. Sexually impotent, but also impotent in the sense that he's unable to save his family. Quentin tries to take up that mantle. He tries to do the things that he thinks he's supposed to do, to stand up for the family honor, to hold on their place, and he fails. He fails in all his physical confrontations, and he remains a virgin, and then he commits suicide. He is impotent. And then Jason is also impotent. He's impotent in his rage. He's ineffective at carrying out the things he wants to do. He doesn't make money. He doesn't get the job. He can't control his family. He can't maintain their place in Southern society. He's not sexually impotent, but in other ways he is. And then, of course, Benji is castrated for his attack on the girls outside the gate. He ends up being castrated as a way, I guess, of saving him from going to the mental hospital. But impotence is, I think, the overall idea that we get from the Compson men, that they are incapable of breaking free of the things that are bringing the family down. But there's also this element of freedom, that Dilsey is asserting her freedom and her family's freedom from the Compsons by encouraging them to separate, not to imitate them, not to do what they do, to separate in that way. And at the same time, the girls in the novel, Caddy and Miss Quentin, represent freedom by breaking free. Whatever the problems that take place in Caddy's life, and I've never read the appendix where it describes, everything that happens with Caddy after the fact of the events of the novel, she is free of the family. She is obviously doing something that makes money. She's living on her own terms. And when Miss Quentin breaks free from the family and pursues whatever love interest she has in the man in the red tie from the show, she is also freeing Caddy from that, because now Caddy has no ties to the family. She has no ties to her brother. She has no ties to her mother. I think this is what Dilsey is referring to when Dilsey says she's seen the beginning and the end, that this then is actually the end of the Compson family, and maybe she's talking about the end of white Southern dominance in the South, and that they're going to have to change their ways of life. Anyway, there you go. There's my best attempt at explaining how the last chapter relates to the others in The Sound of the Fury. I hope you enjoyed reading this. This is still my favorite Faulkner novel, still one of my top 2 or 3 novels of all time. I've really enjoyed it. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below. As always, thank you for watching.